মানে প্রত্যেকটা গ্রুপ তোমাদের প্রেজেন্টেশন খুলে নাও, আর গ্রুপ 1 you can start presenting, sharing the screen and start presenting.
স্যার আমার একটা কোশ্চেন ছিল স্যার।
সোহম, হ্যাঁ।
হুম। না, আপনি যেটা দিয়েছিলেন যে জিডিপি পার ক্যাপিটা অন পিসিআর এরকম দিয়েছিলেন।
আমি তাই দিয়েছিলাম, আমার তো এখন অত মনে নেই, আমি তাই করলাম। তাহলে ঠিক
ওরকম
আছে,
দিয়েছিলেন।
আচ্ছা
ও
তাহলে
যেরকম
ঠিক আছে।
আছে,
আচ্ছা,
প্রথমটা তো ওয়াই হয়, তাই তো? হুম।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, তাহলে ঠিক
হুম।
আছে।
হুম।
Sir, am I audible?
হ্যাঁ, অডিবল। হ্যাঁ, তুমি ওই ইনেবল এডিটিং করে নাও বরঞ্চ, না স্লাইড শোতে যাওয়া যাবে দেখো।
হ্যাঁ।
হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে।
Start করছি স্যার।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ।
Good morning, everyone. We, Group 1 Choco Drop, are here to talk about progress in education and its impact on growth in the context of India. Education directly affects economic growth as it is essential to improve human capital. And economy's production capacity depends on different factors. This include physical capital, technology, a number of workers, as well as their quality. This quality is largely determined by what is called human capital. An increase in workers' educational level improves their human capital, increasing the productivity of their workers and the economy's output. We are here to discuss four such factors affecting growth, namely youth literacy rate, adjusted net enrollment, primary completion rate, and government expenditure on GDP. Youth literacy rate, which is the percentage of the population aged 15 to 24 years who can both read and write with understanding a short, simple statement on everyday life. Adjusted net enrollment is the number of pupils of the school age group for primary education enrolled in either in primary or secondary education expressed as a percentage of the total population in that age group. Primary completion rate or gross intake ratio to the last grade of primary education is a number of new entrants, enrollments minus repeaters, in the last grade of primary education, regardless of age, divided by the population at the entrance age for the last grade of primary education. Data limitations preclude adjusting for students who drop out during the final year of primary education. General government expenditure on education is expressed as a percentage of GDP. We also talk about the gender gap, which is defined as the numeric difference between the indicators for males and the corresponding indicators for females. The total youth literacy rate has steadily increased from 53.74% in 1981 to 91.66% in 2018. Different programs were implemented by the government of India, like Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan in 2001, which aimed at the universalization of elementary education in a time-bound manner, making free and compulsory education to children between the ages of 6 to 14 a fundamental right. Beti Bachao Beti Padhao was introduced in 2015 that aims to generate awareness and improves the efficiency of welfare services intended for girls in India. Further, skill development programs like the Deen Dayal Upadhyay Gram Kaushal Yojana, which is a placement-linked skill development program for the rural youth. Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana, which is a unique initiative by the government of India that aims to train about 24 lakh Indian youth to be industry relevant, skill based, and to prepare them for the global market. And lastly, NREGA, which guarantees right to work in rural areas by providing wage employment to unskilled manual workers, were introduced. People are ensured of at least 100 days of employment in the NREGA scheme in every household to a member who is willing to do unskilled work. Overall, awareness programs by the government and the NGOs have helped people to understand the importance of education. Initiatives like the Anganwadi school which started in 1975 provide non-formal preschool education to rural areas. The focus is mainly on girl child education to combat gender inequality at the grassroots level, which has increased female literacy over the years and decreased the gender gap. Lastly, expenditure on education sector has stayed around 3% over the years, which calls for better allocation of budget on education at least 6% as suggested by every national educational policy since 1968. Shagni will take over from here.
Thank you, Shaq. And yeah, here we talk about the adjusted enrollment rate, right? So the adjusted enrollment rate gives us an idea about what percentage of the population can have access to primary education. So we see that in the 1970s, adjusted net enrollment rate was higher for males initially as compared to females. Gradually, the adjusted net enrollment rate for females happened to surpass the net adjustment rate for males in 2007, and the gap between them decreased. Why did it happen so? Because as the education that was accessible to the human population as a whole increased and the gender gap between the two decreased, we saw that both males and females could actually access education along with proper facilities, which helped them decrease the amount of uh, gap that existed. So a steady rise in female enrollment was seen in steady rise in female enrollment was seen till 2002, and we also see that enrollment rate in males did also plunge around 1990. Uh, though the count is still increasing, but the rate of increase has fallen down. It finally does start decreasing around 2000, as we can see in the graph. There are various reasons as to why this is happening, mainly due to the amount of uh, privilege that we properly need to now steadily access education at this point of time, and how the rich keep on getting richer and the poor keep on getting poorer, and how that acts and how that acts as a deterrent to the amount of proper education one can have access to. Next slide, please. Uh, and after which we come to the primary completion rate. That as we can see that the latest value of primary completion rate in India was reported as of 91.66% in 2019. Uh, from 1971, there has been a steady increase in the primary completion rate, but it reached a slump around 1996. We see that a sharp fall happens in the completion rate in the late 90s period, which was later recovered with a steady growth rate, and it again reached a minor slump around 2010, but then quickly recovered to what was seen to be the highest achieved value of 97.71% in 2015. Talking about the gender gap here, as for the gender gap, we can observe from the trend line that quite there has been quite a huge disparity between the males and females. But from the early 2000s, we can see that the female ratio slowly started to rise, which narrowed the gap, and eventually the female ratio surpassed the male ratio from around 2000s. We can bring a reason to this as to how the society slowly got sensitized, and as in uh, girls were encouraged more and more to go to schools than they were during the 1970s, which also came through as human capital was brought up with proper education, and with proper education we saw growth in both a societal and an economical level. Next slide, please. Yes, now we come to expenditure on education, where we see that the quantitative expansion of the Indian education sector has been overall impressive. The expenditure share in GDP has increased over the years from 1997, and we can also see that the government expenditure on education in India was seen to be about 3.36% in 1997, and it was less than the expected value. It continued to rise to about 4.4% in 1999 and exceeded the expected value. It fell sharply after 1999, falling to 3.14% in 2006. And after 2006, the expenditure on education started to rise, rising to 3.86% in 2012. The government expenditure on education fell slightly to 3.84% in 2013. Here we provide to you some, as you can see in the graph, and with the statistics as to how the government puts its expenditure on education and stuff, and how sometimes it falls below the expected value, and sometimes it goes above the expected value. Next slide, please. After which, the to collect all the points that we talked about and bring about an overall conclusion to the presentation that we were about to put. That is, quality education along with the level of education is an important factor in enhancing promoting economic growth. Public education expenditure started to exert a positive impact on Indian GDP growth once the country embraced substantial industrial reforms since 1980s. We also have to keep in mind while talking about industrial reforms how people started getting more open-minded as uh, they were put into a cycle of education, which by which I try to say that education and growth, this is kind of a cycle, right? When you get into that cycle with proper education, you have more growth. With more growth, you have better infrastructural facilities. With better infrastructural facilities, you have better education. Now, primary school enrollment and literacy rates have risen encouragingly in recent times, although secondary school participation is still low and unequally distributed, which comes back to the privilege factor, which is again attributed to the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. Since economic incentives for acquiring secondary schooling are high, demand for secondary schooling is likely to be strong, suggesting that greater participation is hindered by a combination of
Okay,
constraints.
Shagnik, let me just interrupt. In the second point, you have said that public education expenditure started to exert a positive impact on GDP growth.
Yes, sir.
Have you shown this result? Where?
Uh, no, sir. In the slide, we haven't because we thought that this was not really such an important point as when we would be rounding this up, we would state it as a conclusion.
Okay. Secondly, the data that you have shown is mainly primary school enrollment and literacy. Did you
Right,
show
sir.
the secondary school?
No, sir. We did not show the secondary school enrollment rates, sir, because as I was going to say, as it's written in the conclusion
No,
that
that is
uh,
okay. No, that is okay. You okay? Then again, you
no,
are
sir,
commenting on that
right,
private
sir, right,
schooling sector is growing rapidly in urban areas.
right,
But
sir,
again, you have not looked at private schooling or the rural urban gap, right?
right, right, sir. We'll keep that in mind. Yes, sir.
So, no, listen to me. When you are drawing the conclusions, you just have to, you can bring in only those points which has been covered in your findings or discussion. Okay?
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Yes, sir.
You don't have to, if you have found out only one major finding, that is fine. There's no rule that you have to give 7 or 8 conclusion points in the conclusion.
Okay, sir.
Okay, so I think this is the last slide, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, okay, okay. Thank you very much. It's a nice presentation. You
Thank you,
can,
sir.
yeah, stop sharing now. And underdogs, you can now start
Yes, sir.
presenting.
Yes, sir. So is my screen visible?
Yeah, it's visible.
And so am I not? Sorry. So then I'll begin.
Yes, please.
So good morning, everyone. Today, our topic of discussion is the analysis of most of like 4 key educational parameters of Bangladesh, and to determine the progress and the benefits of the advent of these parameters and how they have changed over the years for the state of Bangladesh. As Now, education is something which obviously has a very great impact on creation of human capital, and Bangladesh being a developing nation, which is also uh, slowly becoming a big creator of service providers. We believe that education is a very definite and important factor to be considered for a total economic growth of a country like Bangladesh, right? So the first indicator that we are considering is basically the total adult literacy in Bangladesh, which can be seen to have a steady rise, a steady increase over the years, right? From 81, which is the first time that Bangladesh actually had or measured their literacy post their liberation war and post their independence from Pakistan in 1971. And since 81, we see that there has been a lot of increase and that education has made substantial development over the years. Another reason, a key very reason of how education policy in Bangladesh has been is of the 1972 Kudrat a Kudrati education policy, which was implemented in Bangladesh, which is why, like, we see that the literacy has risen over time, right? Now, Bangladesh, as we know, being a Asian country and being under various issues such as riots and socio-political, socio-economic imbalances, we see that every time that there has been a stable democratic government or a or any form of government which has tried to focus on social development, we see that there has been increase in the literacy. Now, the thing about this data is that many of the data points were missing, as for years Bangladesh only measured the literacy over the course of 10 years, right? So which is why until the last decade or the till last 15 years, which is when we see the apparent fluctuations. Before that, we believe that it is the data has been obviously interpolated, and like it is not entirely suitable for us to comment on those, except just mention the trend of what has happened in Bangladesh. Secondly, the second indicator that we want to focus on is the net enrollment rate, right, of primary education, of primary in primary school only. We believe that even here the data has been interpolated to some extent, but since we get a trend and there are some points which we would really like to mention over here, right? There are certain things about net enrollment from the 1972 policy which happened in Bangladesh. There were many inefficiencies, and the consequences of that were fatal to many of these. Right? We see how by the time it came to 1986, 1987, there was a drop in enrollment. However, considering these, we believe that the Mufizuddin Education Commission, which was set up in 1988, had some impact, and its review going to the National Assembly and it being implemented at that point, we believe that it created a steady recovery, which we can see it very clearly in this graph, right? More so in the last few years that we could consider the data in we could only consider the data till 2010, as there wasn't anything possible for us to like show after that. The reforms which did happen, there were two main reforms in very recent years, right? One in 2008, and the Bangladesh National Education Policy, which was a very big reform which happened in 2010, right? There were many aspects of this policy, such as creating a more pragmatic curriculum, creating giving stipends to students to enroll. They had targets such as there has to be a primary school or there has to be a school in every village. So we believe that besides giving incentives to students for joining schools and to go into education, there was also a large scale reform to provide more opportunities of education to these people through the reforms of 2008 and 2010, right? Which is why we see that in considering primary school, there has been a sort of like increase and a sort of steady situation in Bangladesh. The third criteria, the third parameter that we're taking is that of primary completion rate. Again, the data here was not very vast, but we like to take two very distinct timelines over here and would like to focus on that. When we see the early on stages, when we're considering the data for when we're considering the data for Bangladesh, we see that there was a huge dip in the primary completion rate, like around 10 years after independence, right? We believe that this rate, this dip is somewhat related to the liberation war, where like it was a matter of huge turmoil in Bangladesh, and like there was a war, there was political instability, there was socio-economic instability, which is why I think we think that a lot of educational policies were missed out, and a lot of people were not able to complete their education in this position, which is why we see that there was a dip over here, right? The other end that we want to consider is the reforms of 2008 over here. When we're considering the reforms of 2008, we see that there again was a dip, which we can see. However, that again was recovered through the 2008 reforms. As we said, it provided more opportunities, and more so, we believe that it was also reforms from 1996 and reforms extending from 1991, which had a lagged effect, and which we can see in the recovery and the extension over here, right? The fourth criteria that we want, the fourth parameter which we're considering is the expenditure on education. Now, post-independence, Bangladesh has consecutively given a lot of importance and significance to the education budget. In fact, there have been times where education budget has peaked in different administrations of very different parties in Bangladesh, for which we understand that education is something which has shown promise in most administrations and governments in Bangladesh, right? Which is why we see the only few fallacies that did happen was around the early 2000s, when like there was a huge FDI decline and like huge decline, economic decline in Bangladesh, which is why we believe that the Bangladesh government gave a little more importance to growth sectors, to growth sectors, trade sectors, with and less on social development indicators, social development sectors like education. Uh, and that is why we see that over this very phase of the early 2000s, there has been a small dip in the education expenditure budget. However, that peak again happened in 2008 and 2010, when we have already mentioned there were huge education reforms happening. In fact, even in 1991, right? In 1991, there was the Khalid Zia government. The Khalid Zia government wanted to focus a lot on education, and hence had a very big budget in that time as well, right? Related to the past years, hence we see a steady increase henceforth. When we're talking about the already mentioned four indicators, we also like to mention the gender gap which has existed in this nation, in this scenario, right? We see that when we're considering the gender gap, it is decreasing, and not only is the gender gap decreasing, but also the literacy all over the entire population, considering males and females, has been going up over the years, right? When we're considering this very time, it is a limited time period, since we could only consider the last 15 years. But what we can understand, and what we can comment on, is that the national education policy, which was introduced in 2010, had a lacked response and had a lacked consequence around 5 years, which was yet again seen in other indicators as well. Since 2016, there has been a constant rise in there has been a constant rise in overall adult literacy, and the gender gap has been decreasing over time, as we can see that. And after that, the gender gap has not changed much, uh, and that's what we can say about adult literacy. However, in net enrollment rate, there is something which would really like to mention, right? Over here, we see that in the initial years, from 87 to around 96, there was a huge gap uh, in the net enrollment rate, right? But since 1998, there has been a steady increase of the number of enrollment of females in Bangladesh. This is something which is why this happened is number one, because gender gap reduction for enrollment in primary school has been a very key aspect of Sheikh Hasina's education policies. And not only that, we also believe that this is a lagged response again from Khalid Zia's policy in 1991, when she tried to bring in stipends for female students, and she also brought in ideas such as a free education for girls till class 10. So that is something which we obviously believe that primary education has had a big impact of those policies. More so, the Shamsul Haq Committee in 1997 introduced a report which again had impacts on the education policy which happened. And thus, what we still see is that gap between the enrollment of males and females in Bangladesh has been reducing, but females are still much less than males in Bangladesh. When we, once continuing from the net enrollment, we believe that this is a much important, we believe a very interesting thing happens over here, right? The last point I mentioned was that women have less enrollment in primary education. However, in the last 5 years, even considering the years that that we can produce in the next graph, we see that females are much more likely to have to complete primary education in Bangladesh. This is something which is of very important, of very significant, and something which we obviously believe to be very aspirational for most developing and conservative economies and societies. And lastly, again, primary completion rate, we didn't have a lot of data to be produced, and this is all we could actually provide. Lastly, the conclusions that we could draw on a very superficial level are that there is a very lagged effect which can be witnessed across most parameters after policy execution has happened, and poor economic conditions have created the incentive for diverting more resources towards growth sectors and less towards education that has happened over the years and over administrations. And lastly, again, the point that I mentioned, that this is a very aspirational thing, that that women are completing primary education, even though their enrollment is much less than men in Bangladesh. Thank you.
Okay, it's a good presentation, but just the see. I mean, people are going to focus on the first and last part. Okay,
Yes, sir.
in the last part, whatever you have said can be understood from what you have presented. There should be a link. So
Yes.
that is okay. That you have done, but I would say that is one thing. I mean, you should have one. Uh, I mean, what is the main finding? That is one. Sorry, what is the main finding? Has the net enrollment gone up, gone down, whatever? The trend, the time trend.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Okay.
So you can see that it has increased for both men and women. What has happened to gender gap? Something like that.
Yes, sir.
Then come to policy.
All right, sir. All
The
right.
2 points that you have made are fine, but first present the findings in short, and then and then give the policy
All
part.
right. All right, sir. So we
Yeah.
just did not mention it for the last few gender graphs. We did it for the initial line graphs, I guess.
No, I mean for the just at the end.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Just I mean give 1 or 2 lines on the main finding. Just sum up everything.
All
That
right.
your expenditure has gone up. I'm just what I'm saying is not correct, but I'm just saying that
Yes, sir.
way that you should give, that primary enrollment has gone up among both males and females, but it has gone up faster among males.
Yes, sir.
Education expenditure has decreased over time. The, the broad findings, 3 or 4, broad important findings, not for all the graphs, but for the most, what you feel is the most important finding.
Yes, sir.
Okay,
All right.
thank you very much. So now we are going to have the tarantulas.
Yes, sir. Oishi, will you present? All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Ratul speaking on behalf of the Tarantulas, and we'll be talking about the gender dimension in the analysis of education and the country of concern today. The country of concern is Brazil. Uh, a little disclaimer that the data that was provided in the World Bank data reserve was inadequate for us to do the graphs and analysis. So we had to use external sources, the links to which will be added in this presentation later on when we submit the presentation to sir. All right. Today, no, the first slide we have definitions of the indicators used. We are using four indicators, that is literacy rate, school enrollment rate, primary completion rate, and expenditure on education as a percentage of GDP. Now, a little bit about everything. Literacy rate is basically the given age group of 15 and above that can read and write. Uh, the youth literacy rate to ages 15 to 24 and the elderly to ages 65 and above. This total percentage of the population uh, is the literacy rate. Now next we have the school enrollment rate, which is the number of children of official primary school age who are enrolled in primary education as a percentage of total children of the official school age population. That is, we see that students who are very young, they are introduced to school and environment where they are taught basic things such as reading, writing, and mathematical abilities. Next, we have primary completion rate, which talks about, which is also known as the gross intake ratio to the last grade of primary education, is the number of new entrants in the last grade of primary education. This is regardless of age, in contrast to school enrollment rate, where it has an age. Lastly, we have expenditure on education as a percentage of GDP, which is the government expenditure on total education. And if we take an example, we have Brazil that reported at 6.0885% in 2018, according to World Bank collection of development indicators, which was a significant increase from 4.97% of 1995. And we have the next slide. Here we are looking at the trends in literacy level. On the right hand side, we can see that the graph from 2000 to 2020 has been made. The data again was slightly inadequate, so we could not have the whole graph. Uh, in 2018, Brazil's literacy rate was about 93.23%, which is a convincing development from 1980, wherein it was 74.59%. We see a huge jump from 74.59 to 93.23%. Now, this was because of the education system that was implemented in Brazil, which demanded children from 6 to 14 to attend school. If we take Sao Paulo for an example, it is home to more than 500 universities. Next slide. Here we are looking at trends in school enrollment rate. On the top, we have again inadequate data. We are presenting a graph from 1999 to 2020. On the right lower side, we see a much clearer picture since the points have been joined. Now, the primary definition of this is the ratio of children of official school age who are enrolled into school uh, in uh, in official school age. Primary education provides children with basic reading, writing, and mathematical abilities. Um, for example, value for school enrollment percent net. We are not talking about the gross percent. We are talking about net percent. In Brazil was 96.30 as of 2017. Over the past 18 years, it reached a maximum value of 98.08 in 2012 and a minimum value of 91.59 in 2007. Can we have the next slide? Uh, Here I'm going to talk about trends in primary completion rate. On the right hand side, we are seeing a graph which is from 1999 to 2020, although what we really see is a graph of 2001 to 2004. The average value for Brazil during that period was 109.12%, with a minimum of 100.68% in 2004 and a maximum of 114.2% in 2002. Now, if you look at the geographical distribution, we see that 31.2 million pupils enrolled at primary level were predominantly concentrated in Southeast, which makes up for 39% of the total, and Northeast, which makes up for 31% of the total region, followed by South and North, which are 14% and 9% respectively. Then we have the Center West at 7%. The absolute majority of pupils, which is at 88.4%, attended public schools in urban areas. Uh, this is a result of the intense urbanization process and the education policies implemented by Brazil over the recent decades, and the growing participation of public sector in the provision to education. That is it for my part. Now Yash will take over. Yash.
Yes. Now we'll be moving on to expenditure on education as a percentage of GDP. Now, as evident from the graph, ranging from 1996 to 2000, the expenditure on education had fallen bit by bit. However, after a few years, that is from 2004 till 2016 or 17, it grew at a considerable pace. Now, this can be attributed to high amount of investment into the primary education. So in total, public spending in primary education represented about 3% of country's GDP in the latest data that was available, which is in 2018. This was again a result of the strong foundation that the Brazilian government had set up in the initial years. Now, can we move on to the next slide? Now, these are certain additional observations which were not directly linked to the graphs that we observe, but are again very important if we want to analyze education and how it integrates the gender dimension. So you can have a look at it. This again talks about three aspects. Number one, dropout rates, repetition rates. Since we were talking of primary education, and you could have observed that the primary education was at times more than 100. Now, that may be due to the following reasons. It may happen that certain underage students or certain overage students have enrolled in primary education later than the conventional norm, as a result of which, or some people might have been repeating those courses, as a result of which it can be over 100. Second, we saw how education is compulsory. So this again, the second point talks about why primary completion rate was integral in building a good foundation for children to step in. And third part again talks about the disparity between the rich and the poor when it comes to access to education. Now we also talk about malnutrition, child labor, and high examination failure. Now we'll talk about, can we move on to the next slide, and we'll talk about the gender dimension in the education sector. Now, as we know, education as a domain has always been a very education as a domain has always been a gendered institution because of certain power dynamics, skewed power dynamics that already exist, and certain difference in social spaces that different societies have propagated. Now, if we look at the literacy level in Brazil, it is very interesting to note that from 2000 onwards, it has made enormous strides in addressing these disparity. Literacy rates have actually soared, and now women outnumber men when it comes to tertiary education. Now, tertiary education also includes various sorts of vocational training that is being imparted. So automatically translates into more skill and employability of these women. Now, as the World Bank notes, again, these are certain statistics which were very interesting to take note of, that women in the workforce now count 8.8 years of schooling, while men, on the other hand, only average 7.7 years. So this is again a vast difference if we look at the analysis. Can we move on to the next slide? Now, this again talks about school enrollment rate. Now, as Ratul had spoken about, how school enrollment rate is very closely linked to primary education, primary completion rate. Uh, now, as we can see in 2004, the male enrollment rate percentage was only greater than the female enrollment percentage by a very by a quite a huge distance. That is 4
Okay,
point.
Yash, may I
Yes,
just interrupt a little bit?
yes, Ratul, yes, sir.
You have If you look at the trend, the actual trend, and the linear trend that you have used, are they really matching?
No, sir, they're not. So this is primarily because there is little to
Very
no
little
data
data.
for
Yeah,
Brazil when it comes to gender gap.
yeah. So I understand that, and I appreciate your problem. So what I'm trying to say is that I mean, if your data is not giving you results, you have to limit your analysis. Okay,
Yes, sir. Understood.
don't give a you have drawn a line graph. Don't give a line graph. Just give a bar graph.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Okay, and
understood.
then don't draw the linear thing
Okay,
interpolation.
sir. So we'll change it when I submit the
Yeah,
PPT.
yeah. See, these are mistakes that will happen. You're inexperienced. Even most senior people makes these mistakes. But what we say is don't see your data also has a capacity.
Yes,
Don't
sir.
make it do something which it can't do.
All right, sir. We'll take
Okay.
note of
But the
that.
graphs are very nicely drawn. You're explaining well.
Yes, sir. Now can we move on to the next slide? Yes, sir. Again, this was the data for primary completion rate was not available at all, so we had to take use of external help to validate our findings. And from what we found, from 1999 to 2011, the average value was about 0.94. By average value, we mean that for every 100 male pupils enrolled, for every 100 male pupils who have completed primary education, there are 94 female pupils. Now this the maximum was attained at 97, 0.97 in 1999. This has again relatively remained stable, although it may appear that it has been fluctuating quite a lot. But if you look at the absolute values, it has remained above the 90% mark, which is again a decent improvement when it comes to a developing country like Brazil. Now, there are certain additional observations that we have found out while analyzing education in the field, the gender dimension in the field of education. So, can we have the next slide? Yeah. So here we again talk about how the education deficit has been part of the Brazilian reality, and they have been able to somehow eliminate and reverse this gap throughout the 20th century. And since we are analyzing from 2000 onwards, there has been a constant push to plug this deficit. uh, while the country, if we look at certain if we look at certain policy background, it is egalitarian when it comes to providing education and health rights. It continues to have large gender gaps within the workforce and government representation. This again can be attributed to the fact that even though people have the same educational level, Brazilian women have been earning 25% less than men. Again, this is huge when it comes to this is again, if we correlate this finding to what we found when it comes to tertiary primary education, where women outnumber the men, their earnings don't match. So there is again a mismatch between skill, employability, and the gender dimension attached to it. So only 16% of the executive directors in financial sectors are women, and again 11% of the elected candidates in the 2014 federal elections were women. So again, there's a lack of representation both at the government level and when it comes to the labor force or the workforce. This again brings us to the end of a presentation. Thank you. So we'll take note of the comment that you've made, and also add sources for all the graphs. We forgot to do that, so we'll do that when we submit the PPT. Thank you.
Sorry, can you go to slide 11, please? I was muted. I didn't realize it. Okay. Again, I mean, see, I mean, I what I like about these additional observations is more conclusion. If you go through the first 2 points, you're getting a broad picture of what is happening. that you have a very gendered society where women were discriminated against, but the situation has been reversing in recent years. Okay. Uh, to some extent, the first and second point are overlapping. So you could combine them and reduce what you have written over here. But the third point, uh, can you just go back to the slide 10, please? Okay. So have you presented any information on wages, earnings?
No, so we have not
Yeah.
presented any information on
Yeah.
earnings, but what we did was in the primary completion rate, we introduced a point about tertiary education when we talk about
No, I'm
education.
talking about the earnings.
No, sir, we've not introduced
Yeah.
anything for earnings. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So the thing is that, see, uh, all of you, I mean, don't get worried that you have too few points. When you're making a presentation, it has to be very sharp and concise. If you have few points, that will not go against you. See, and you should also realize that if you have a lot of data, a huge data set, you can study a lot, you can study many things, bring into uh, your study many findings. But if you focus on just one or two variables and you don't have good data on it, automatically you become handicapped. But it's like something that if I tie up your hands, or let us say I tie up your legs and say that, okay, you have to choose participate in some sports or games. So, will you go for athletes, athletic activities, cricket, football, racing? If I tie up your legs, you should rather go for maybe chess, maybe bridge, something like that. So remember this in finding that your objective, your data set, what you have, that defines what you can do. Nobody can say that, okay, why didn't you do such detailed analysis? Go back to one slide, slide 9. Yeah, I mean, why didn't you have data from 1999 to 2020? You discussed the results only for 4 5 years. I can't blame you for this. I have to accept it. There's a data limitation. You can only do this much. You cannot create data. Okay. So don't get worried if you have just one or 2 points. In fact, when you're coming to a conclusion, one strong point is what we require, a take home message. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank
sir.
you,
No,
sir.
thank you.
Okay. Now, Macos.
Yes, sir. Pratyush, will you present your screen?
Yes, I am presenting.
Sir, we are starting. I
Yeah,
hope the screen is visible.
it is visible. I'm going on mute. Yeah, please start.
Good afternoon, sir. We, the members of Group 4 today, are presenting on the topic Progress in Education and its Impact on Growth, a case study of China. Next slide, please. We are going to focus on the impact of education based on various indicators such as education expenditure as a percentage of real GDP, literacy rate, and primary completion rate. We are showing trends from 1990 to 2010 period, and the gender gaps are also analyzed for the same. Interpolations are used whenever there is a missing observation. The data source of our study is derived from the World Bank datasite. Next slide, please. As we know, literacy rate of the population is defined as the percentage of literates to the total population aged 7 years and above, or the persons of the same age group with the ability to read, write, and understand any language. Gender gap in literacy is defined as the difference between male's literacy level and the female literacy level. As we see in case of China with rapid economic growth, since China has adopted economic liberalization, the increase in parental income enables more children to obtain at least a basic education, and this greatly increases chances of girls going to school as well. Previously, it was common for parents to prioritize the education of sons
Anisha,
over that.
Anisha, Anisha, may I just interrupt once, please? You're saying that if your income goes up, this
Yes, sir.
increases chances of girls going to school. Why?
No, actually, sir, because in the in any economy, uh, people all in the earlier age, in the earlier
Ghabre
periods,
ghabre যেও না, ঘাবড়ে যেও না. Don't get nervous.
people always focused on the education of their sons, since they were supposed to be the bread earners, and as we know that females education was not considered as so much importance in the previous
Hmm.
years. So as economy grew and economic growth increased, it implies that the income level also rose, so uh, people could opt for the education of the female child as well.
না দেখো, এখানে তোমার দুটো জিনিস হচ্ছে। একটা হচ্ছে একটা ইনকাম এফেক্ট। ইফ ইয়ার বাজেট ইজ গোয়িং আপ, ইফ ইয়ার ইনকাম ইজ গোয়িং আপ, তাহলে তুমি তোমার মানে কনজিউমার থিওরি ম্যাক্সিমাইজ ইউটিলিটি ম্যাক্সিমাইজেশনের টার্মসে ভাবো। ইফ দ্য হাউস হোল্ড ইনকাম ইজ গোয়িং আপ, দ্য বাজেট লাইন ইজ শিফটিং আউটওয়ার্ডস, রাইট?
Yes, sir.
সো ইউ ক্যান
Yes, sir.
পারচেজ মোর অফ অল কমোডিটিস। একটা ইনকাম এফেক্ট হচ্ছে, অ্যান্ড দিস ইনক্লুডস এডুকেশন। So
Yeah.
the education of children will go up, right? আচ্ছা, এবারে যেটা হচ্ছে, you are talking about not education but the gender gap. Okay?
Yes, sir.
আচ্ছা, এবারে যেটা হচ্ছে যে I spend more on all my children. So the gap will remain. মানে আগে ধরো আমি ছেলেদের ক্লাস 5 অবধি পড়াতাম, মেয়েদের 2 অবধি পড়াতাম। এবার আমার ইনকাম বাড়লো, দুজনকেই আমি আরো এক্সট্রা 3 ইয়ার্স অফ এডুকেশন দিলাম। তাহলে কি হচ্ছে 8 and 5, দ্য জেন্ডার গ্যাপ ইজ স্টিল রিমেনিং। তোমাকে
Yes, sir.
তাহলে
The
দেখাতে
gender.
হবে যে ইনকাম বাড়লে তোমার বয়েজ এবং গার্লস এর মধ্যে অ্যালোকেশনটা চেঞ্জ করবে। সেইটা দেখানোটা
Okay, sir.
একটু ডিফিকাল্ট। অত ঘাবড়ে যেও না। কি আছে, ভুল করলে গোল্লা দিয়ে দেবো না -10 দেবো? ঠিক আছে? সো ডোন্ট গেট নার্ভাস। ওকে, সো ডোন্ট ড্র কনক্লুশনস, ইউ ক্যান অ্যাট মোস্ট স্পেকুলেট। সেটা খুব ক্লিয়ারলি বলে দেবে, ইট ইজ পসিবল বাট দেয়ার ইজ নো প্রুফ। ওকে, ওকে, থ্যাংক ইউ। গো অন প্লিজ।
Oh, okay. Uh, so, in China, after the economic liberalization, uh, uh, the law of 9-year compulsory education came into effect, which established that the requirements and the deadlines for attaining universal education tailored to the local conditions and guaranteed school aged children the right to receive at least 9 years of education. That is 6 years in the primary education level and 3 years in the secondary, which also helped in breaching the gender gap. Next slide, please. Now we come to the primary completion rate. Primary completion rate is defined as the number of new entrants, that is enrollment less repeaters in the last grade of primary education regardless of age divided by the population at the entrance age for the last grade of primary education. In case of China, we see that the gender gap gradually falls as it is pointed out also in the graph. When Huven's leadership came into power, he was dedicated to adjust its growth model, led to a sharp increase in price levels and the cost of maintaining a decent life. As a result, the enrollment of girls in the last stage of primary education has fallen significantly. Sambhav will be taking over from here.
Thank you, Annesha. Uh, Now, starting with the trends in education expenditure as percentage of GDP and PCR in China. Since 1990s, a percentage of government revenues are spent for poor students as rewards, loans, and subsidies, incentivizing education and having positive impact on GDP. School education in the first to ninth grade is compulsory and is fully paid by the government, accounting for rise in PCR. Next slide, please. Literacy has increasing trend all along. This shows that education development had become the main action plan and policy focus of China against poverty. Education is a basic human capital investment to stimulate economic growth by increasing labor productivity and increasing income. Next slide, please.
Actually, just 1 second. This is interpolated data, right?
Yes,
The
sir.
previous one. Okay, ঠিক আছে। ট্রেন্ডটা দেখে আমার just
Can I continue, sir?
yes, please.
Now, despite steady rise in literacy rate, other variables have only a recent rising trend. Education expenditure as percentage of GDP and PCR have shown rising trend since mid 2000s after a phase of sharp decline. In the private colleges and universities, funding system for needy students have a certain degree of institutional deficiencies such as low management channels and limited funding coverage. Funding for poor students is small, narrowing coverage and insufficient protection. As China has gradually grown on the back of manufacturing and export boom, China has also not been able to spend a healthy amount of public expenditure on education because of its inability to reduce unnecessary spending on public administration and improve efficiency of investments on mega public infrastructure projects. Sluggish growth in PCR till mid 2000s is mainly due to sharp rise in prices and rising cost of leading a decent life pushed a section of children to job market. The disconnection between school education and the market, the rapid development of knowledge and technology and information distortion. Also, we see gender gap has become negligible in the literacy level and PCR over the last decade. This brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, just hold on, please. Can you go back 2 slides? আরেকটা? Yeah. না, এটা না। অত না। নামো। Next one. হ্যাঁ, এইখানে। See, I like the way that you have brought in the political factors over here. These are very broad trends and possibly they had an impact. Go to the discussion. Okay, when you're going to the discussion, see, some of the statements that you're making is are very broad. I mean, you have not discussed them. But at the same time, it is possible that what you're saying is true, what we know about the Chinese economy. So obviously you obtain this from some source, right?
Yes, sir.
আচ্ছা, সেখানে একটু চেষ্টা করবে যদি এরকম কোন একটা স্টেটমেন্ট করো, ফার্স্ট অফ অল you're showing a trend, then you're trying to explain this. Fine. Unless you are showing the data yourself, you're simply taking results which are from other studies, cite the studies so that it has some authenticity.
Sir, in the write-up, we are writing the references.
হ্যাঁ, এখানেও একটুখানি জাস্ট কি করবে, ধরো তুমি একটা পড়েছো ওয়ার্ল্ড ব্যাংকের একটা প্রজেক্ট হয়েছিল, স্টাডি হয়েছিল, তাহলে ওয়ার্ল্ড ব্যাংক 2016। ধরো তুমি যেটা বলছো স্পেন্ডিং অন পাবলিক অ্যাডমিনিস্ট্রেশন কজড ইনসাফিসিয়েন্ট ফান্ডিং, ঠিক আছে, গিভ আ সাইটেশন। ওকে, either show that this has happened, or if you are discussing, you have to give the necessary citation based on this.
Okay, sir.
Okay. Okay. That's all. Next. This is cat's paw, please.
Aishwarya, can you please present?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
I
Please
am.
present.
Okay, so I'm starting, sir.
Yes.
Good afternoon, all present here. Today, Group 5, that is Group CAT 4, will be discussing the progress in education and its impact on growth of the economy in South Africa. We analyze the trends of the different indicators of education, which are literacy, enrollment rate, primary completion rate, and expenditure on education as a percentage of GDP in South Africa for the time period 1996 to 2017. We have used interpolation in our analysis for the missing data. We also look at the gender disparities in these indicators. Lastly, we also observe the impact of these indicators on the GDP per capita of the nation. The method we have used in this particular project is graphical analysis using scatter plots and line graphs. All the data we've used here has been extracted from the World Bank data. So we start the analysis. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Aishwarya. Yes, thank you. So the first indicator is literacy rate, which is defined as the percentage of the population of a given age group that can read and write. Here we have worked with the adult literacy rate, which corresponds to ages 15 and above. We can see from the graph that there has been a slight increase in the literacy rate over the years. It can be due to various reasons, one being the different policies taken by the government in South Africa. Next, we have the net primary school enrollment rate. It is nothing but the number of children of official primary school age who are enrolled in primary education as a percentage of the total children of the official school age population. From the graph, we can see that the primary school enrollment rate in South Africa has been fluctuating over the years. But once we check the line of it, it's clear that there has been a gradual decrease. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So then we have primary completion rate. Mm. So it is the percentage of students completing the last year of primary school. So in this graph, we have seen that there is an increase in PCR up until 2004, and it has reached 95.15% at that stage. But after that, the PCR has been decreasing, which is very evident from the graph. The data has There was a lot of data which was missing, so it's quite interpolated. So the next which we have is the government expenditure on education, which is expressed as a percentage of GDP. Government expenditure has been somewhat constant over the years. The government of South Africa considers education its highest domestic priority and the single greatest long-term challenge facing the country. Education receives the greatest share of government expenditure, which is almost 5% of the GDP. Srijoni will continue from here. Thank you, sir.
Yes, moving on to the next slide. Yes, so literacy rate is an outcome indicator to evaluate educational attainment. The literacy rate data can predict the quality of future labor force and can be used in ensuring policies for life skills for both men and women. It can also be used as a proxy instrument to see the effectiveness of education system. That is, a high literacy rate suggests the capacity of an education system to provide a large population with opportunities to acquire literary skills. As suggested by the gender wise trend, in South Africa, adult women, that is above 15 years, have always been left behind in the educational sector due to patriarchal suppression in the period before 1994. In our study, the mean literacy rate of all years between 1996 to 2017 recorded that adult male literacy rate surpasses female by 2.9%. Owing to high poverty in 1996, people failed to afford costly education, thereby recording lowest values. However, due to various government interventions like improving school infrastructure and introducing school feeding programs, have increased literacy rate around 2015 or so. The increase, however, is greater in case of females than males, thus narrowing down the gap substantially into 2017, which is an improvement as compared to 2006. Moving on to the next slide. In many African countries, far more boys.
Srijani, just 1 second, please. Can you go back
Yes,
to
sir,
the
yes,
earlier
sir.
slide? See, you're seeing that gender disparity has um, increased till 2006 and then reduced slightly in recent
Yes, sir.
years.
Yes, sir.
It's not very clear from the data over here. Okay,
Yes, sir.
so
From the data, actually, we had to interpolate a lot, and
no, that's okay. No, what I'm saying is that you have given the blue line and the orange line for male and female, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, what you could also have done is drawn, estimated the gap and plotted this. Now, when you do that, the gap will be about 5. I think it will be even less, 5 to something like that.
Yes, so the gap is actually 4.6 to be
Yeah,
precise.
something like that.
Yes,
Yeah,
sir. Yes,
and in different periods is different.
yes,
What
sir.
you could have done was made a secondary axis.
Oh,
Okay.
okay, okay, sir. Yes, sir.
And shown the gap in the secondary axis as a line, straight line. Okay, that would have
Okay,
been
sir.
more
Yes, sir.
visually more.
Yes, so we actually found out the gap, but we didn't plot it over here in the graph.
Yeah, if you plot it, it gives even more information.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, sir, shall I continue?
Yes, please.
Yes, so in many African countries, far more boys attend school than girls. But in South Africa, primary school enrollment rates are roughly equal. From 2008 to 2012, the primary school enrollment rate for boys was 87.7%, and for girls, it was 88.2%. However, these enrollment rates hide the large racial disparities that exist in South Africa's education system. Historical legacies of segregation have created a lasting race gap in South African education. This means that quality education in South Africa is disproportionately more accessible to its white citizens. In general, girls as well as boys of color are at a severe disadvantage compared to white girls in receiving quality education. This might be why primary school enrollment for males dropped during 1996 to 2005. However, South Africa made progress in reducing discrimination at the end of the apartheid society by adopting several strategies like establishing NGOs, bringing in a mix of awareness campaigns and policy measures that increased enrollments of women drastically and narrowed the gender gap in several African countries. Now, coming to primary completion rate, initially during the period of 1996 to 2003, we see the PCR for females is greater by at least 5% to 8%, which is quite significant given the disadvantageous situation girls face with respect to discrimination. This indicates the success of the various programs that have been developed to improve girls' education in South Africa. However, 2005 onwards, the trend indicated a moreover equal PCR for both males and females. This might be due to one of the measures taken by the government called the Girls' Education Movement GEM, which was launched in 2003. The program aimed to give girls equal access to education, make gender sensitive and more inclusive environments, and give scholarship opportunities. Techno Girls was another project that worked to support girls in pursuing careers in math, science, and technology, typically male dominated fields. And girls from rural disadvantaged communities were given priority in the selection process. This justifies why PCR for females has been greater or at parity in the post 1994 period. Thereby, tackling the primary education sector will help in attaining equality in long run. Now, Sukanya will take over from you.
Okay, just 1 second, please. Again, over here, you're bringing in apartheid, discrimination against white and black, but your data is just on gender. Okay,
Yes,
I
sir.
think your explanation is correct, but you have, since you're not giving any evidence, you have to uh, be a little bit careful. Don't say that apartheid, etc. Say that okay, we are finding this trend around 96. It was very low. Then it started to increase from 2000. So you can see that apartheid was abolished in round about this period. At that time, the blacks were discriminated against, and if you know that a particular community is backward, generally we find gender discrimination higher among them. So you have to see that it's possible. We are not showing it, it's possible. We don't have any proof, but it's possible that these are the explanations. Okay.
Okay, sir. So,
The re-
should we explain those? But over here, we do not have any data as such to
yeah,
support this.
yeah. Either you have to give
Mhm.
some citations, some other people who have shown the work,
Okay, sir. Okay.
or you have to say that, uh, see, the time period is uh, coinciding. You have apartheid. This is the apartheid period. You're just coming out of apartheid. Uh, there will be a transition period. Of once the transition is achieved, gender discrimination starts falling. Okay, something like this.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir.
Okay, continue, please.
Okay, so yeah. Now, so am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So now I'm going to discuss a possible relationship between the government expenditure on education as a percentage of GDP and the GDP per capita in South Africa. After a long period of apartheid, South Africa became a democratic government in 1994, but um, continuous internal protests and violence since the 1940s had led to widespread unemployment, poverty, inequality, and a lack of competitive capacity. So, when the ANC government came into power, they extended the process of economic liberalization by adopting macroeconomic policies to stabilize and grow the economy, address issues of unemployment, which contributed to poverty and inequality um, in the country. The major policies adopted by them from the year 1994 to 2017 include Reconstruction and Development Program, the RDP, the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Program. These policies rapidly led to the containment of fiscal deficit, single-digit inflation, and lower interest rates. In the graph, we see a more or less positive trend line in case of both GDP per capita as well as the government spending on education as a percentage of GDP. But the crests and troughs they go through are similar, except a point where the GDP per capita reaches a very steep point in the year 2011 and a much lower fall in the year 2002 as compared to the government expenditure on education as a percentage of GDP during those periods. So they're not exactly proportional, but the general motion is the same for this, same for both. However, there is no significant relationship that we can determine between the two here. Moving on to the next slide.
How do you know this, that there's no significant relation? Did you run the regression?
Yes, sir, we did. The results were insignificant.
Okay. Now, one thing, even if
Yes,
the
sir.
results are insignificant, present it.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Okay.
In economics, we say that no result is bad. If you get
Okay, sir.
significant results, that also has a meaning. Insignificant results also has a meaning. So don't
Okay, sir.
get discouraged if your regression results are within inverted comma bad.
So should we like include it in the report then?
Yeah, yeah, do it.
Okay. Okay, sir. We'll do that.
Yeah.
Okay. Should I continue?
Yes, please.
Okay. So here we try to observe the relationship between the change in primary completion rate over the years 1996 to 2017 and the GDP per capita. Now, the GDP per capita and the primary completion rate follow a similar trend over the years 1996 to 2017. it was highest in the year PCR was highest in the year 2004. GDP per capita was also rising at the time. Now, after the fall of apartheid in 1994, Nelson Mandela worked tirelessly towards ending racial segregation and unlocking equal funding for all colleges and schools. The primary completion rate has been rising steadily over the years, along with the GDP per capita, which is an indicator of the fact that progress is being made towards having children complete a full course of primary education. The fall in PCR, however, can be attributed to factors like uncommitted teachers, proximity of schools to taverns, and apartheid legacy. At present, even though the enrollment and primary completion rates have risen, all students do not have access to quality education due to poor academic performance, teen pregnancies, and crime. The country still has a rather high dropout rate. So, despite the overall rise in PCR and the GDP per capita over the years, the relationship between these two is not very strong. And there are some discrepancies in the data due to which we cannot explain the entire thing very clearly. So, moving on to the next slide, here we have the relationship between GDP per capita and the adult literacy rate. In South Africa, the education receives the greatest share of government spending, with 21% non interest allocation set aside for basic and higher education. In the graph, both trend lines for GDP per capita and adult literacy rates are mostly upward rising. The adult literacy rate, however, falls steadily after reaching its peak in 2015. The GDP per capita also falls after its peak in 2011. Now, all of this can be attributed to factors like multilingualism, colonization, etc. Many South African teachers also lack proficiency in the subjects they teach, as a result of which South African students do not meet international benchmarks for math and science. Long hours and critical lack of basic school supplies puts an even greater strain on teachers and the school staff. Multilingualism is also a problem for this country, where the number of languages spoken is between 24 and 30, and the country has 11 official languages. Literacy in the official languages is crucial for citizens to keep abreast of information.
No, but
Literacy.
Shukanda, uh,
Yes, sir.
if multilingualism is a problem, it's not a new problem. It has always been a part of society in South Africa.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So,
Yes.
why did the literacy rate increase from in the early part? Why has it suddenly become a problem in the last few years? That is one. And second is,
Yes, sir.
remember, we are talking about literacy. Literacy, if you're talking about schools, particularly high level schools, language may be a problem, right? But we are talking about literacy. People are not coming to school, they are just reading, writing, or they are going to very basic schools. Maybe
Yes,
class
sir.
1, 2, then they are dropping out, or we don't know what they're doing, right?
Yes, sir.
So, I
Yes,
mean,
sir.
the
I tried to look
problems.
it up a lot, but I
No,
don't
it's
think I
fine.
could find.
You see, okay, if you can't explain it, don't try to give a false
Okay,
explanation,
sir.
wrong
Yeah.
explanation.
Yes, sir. We'll keep that
Say
in
that
mind.
this is
Sorry.
something which is surprising and needs to be explained.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. That I'll
Yeah,
do.
go on, please.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to the next slide. So, to sum up, we can say that literacy rate has increased overall over the years. The gender disparity has significantly gone down since it's after a certain rise in 2006. The school enrollment rate, however, has been declining for most of the part after fluctuating for over a certain period. Significantly less disparity gender-wise has been observed in primary completion rate, owing to the lesser number of cases of teenage pregnancies that led to females drop out until till 2000 till the year 2000. It's been 22 years since the fall of apartheid, and the positive change is slow but evident. Um, in 2013, the UNESCO reported a 95% literacy rate amongst South African school-aged youth. This number shows great improvement and is an indicator of the fact that education is not a lost cause in South Africa, and it will improve when the necessary steps are taken. That ends our presentation. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Next group, please. Donald Duck, please.
Sir, just a clarification. So the citations, should we include that in the report, or we have to mention it in the slide itself?
Yeah, you should mention it both in the slide and report. Report তো certainly করতে হবে, স্লাইডেও করে দিলে ভালো হয়।
আচ্ছা স্যার, so the explanation যেটা মানে আমরা নিচ্ছি, the citation will mention it in the slide also.
Yeah.
Okay sir, thank you sir.
স্যার আপনি যে কয়েকটা কারেকশন বললেন ওগুলো কারেক্ট করে দেবো তো রিপোর্টে?
হ্যাঁ, পারলে করে দিও।
ওকে স্যার, ঠিক আছে, থ্যাংক ইউ।
স্যার আমি প্রেজেন্ট করছি।
হ্যাঁ, ঠিক আছে।
Yeah, thank you. Just wait until he.
আচ্ছা, তোমাদের তো ক্লাস কটা থেকে আবার ক্লাস আছে?
So 1:30.
স্যার 1:30 থেকে।
তাহলে ছেড়ে দাও আমার মনে হয়। না না, তো দুটো প্রেজেন্টেশন মানে 1:30টা বেজে যাবে। এটা নেক্সট দিন তোমরা দুজন করে নিও স্টার্টে।
Okay sir. Okay sir.
ঠিক আছে, তারপরে আমি বাকি ক্লাসটা নেব।